And one of the ways that that's happened is you basically allow commentators a space to legitimate views that are completely irrational, that are bigoted. And you completely forget sort of the political stuff. So I mean, for Park 51, I mean, you know, we talked about Pam Geller's on the air, Brian Fisher. I mean, these are, and they're legitimated, right? So it's somehow, this is okay. Their viewpoint is entirely, it's a side, and it's good to have this side. Well, but this is a whole problem of what's been going on, and this is also goes to the Juan Williams controversy, and I mean, there's so many things that have happened. And the problem is, you can have a viewpoint out there, and that's okay, but if there's something so clearly irrational as bigoted, you know, statements that have no actual factual basis, which these do, you need to call them out as that, you know. So when Juan Williams made his comment about the Muslim garb, the problem I had was, you know, it'd be one thing if he said, well, and there's something really wrong with me saying this, but he didn't. And then, of course, the defense always becomes freedom of speech, which is the same thing with the cartoons in Europe, you know. When freedom of speech is your first, your last, and your only defense, you don't really have a defense, okay? And this is a fundamental fact. There's something far deeper that's going on here that basically people are refusing to acknowledge. And this is basically the environment has been poisoned by this. We have basically legitimated a lot of these completely irrational views that are not really based in any sort of fact whatsoever. We have no context, no understanding of other variables, other things that are in play, and it's become accepted. And you see the backlash. You see Islamophobia as a campaign, a smart campaign strategy in the most recent midterm elections, and it's very dangerous. And I think part of it is we need to, you know, we need to be a lot more active with the press in general in terms of the media and holding them accountable. And you know, you can't do that. That's a fundamental problem. You cannot allow irrational, bigoted points to be viewed as legitimate. You can say them. You have the right to say them, certainly. But someone at some point in time needs to call it out for what it is.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal critique is that there's no such thing as being too right-wing in today's media. You can never be too right-wing, but you can be too far left-wing. I mean, if Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King was actually a pacifist point of view on a major mainstream media network, think about it. Would you ever see it? I doubt it. It'd be very difficult, and obviously it would largely be mocked, I think, if it were the case. Anyways, I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. Because we have lots of males up here, I'm going to try to preference women down there. And I will run around with the microphone. Okay, here I come. If you don't have a question, I'm going to cold call somebody.
A quick comment and then a question was precisely about the point that you made. Although you are a very erudite and charming group of men, is it not possible for at least one woman to be present on the panel? There are millions of us. We're educated, we're articulate, and we're well qualified to be on the panel up there with you, and I find it difficult to believe that there was not one, if not dozens of women who could have been present on the panel today. Number two, you began your conversation with the question of rational fear and irrational fear of Muslims. But I think that is begging the question, because you are positing what we call in philosophy and literary criticism an overdetermined relation between the bad acts of certain human beings who happen to be Muslim. You mentioned Fort Hood, you mentioned 9/11, all of these kind of things. But is it because they are Muslim? It's because they are the people that they are. I think there must be a secular democratic ethic that overcomes the overdetermined relationship between Muslim and what a person who happens to be a Muslim may or may not do. And I find that that was begging the question a little bit. Yes, of course, there's rational fears and irrational fears. Many people do many bad things in the world, but is the man who shoots two people in Southeast, is he a killer because he's black? No, he's a killer because of the type of human being he is. is somebody who blows up the trade centers. Is it because they are not Muslim? No, it's because the people that they are. Just as the good acts done by hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world daily, it's because they're good people, very good people. And I think that that is problematic for a beginning of the discussion to play into the question of rational and irrational fear by targeting a Muslim who has done these awful acts. It's not because they're Muslim, it's because they are the human beings that they are.
What's the question?
What's the question? How can you get around that dilemma and this question of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim and relating that to the rational and irrational fear? I don't think there's a connection, but how can you get around that if you would want to?
Let me just, you can blame the guy thing on me. I have a wife and 2 daughters. I needed 2 hours away from the ladies, so I stacked the panel. No, but I'll actually disagree with Faiz on this, and this will go right to your question. When I was doing research for CARE's Islamophobia report, he basically used the definition that's out there. I didn't feel irrational was appropriate, because that means there is a rational fear of Islam. And I learned years ago that it doesn't just apply to religion. I'm glad to see I'm not the only person in the room who will remember this, but for people who can remember the early 90s, during the Bosnian War, the Serbians set up what were known as rape camps. So they basically took the Muslim women, put them in these camps, and abused them around the clock. And I remember reading transcripts of the trials afterward of Serbian guards telling Muslim women, "We will rape you and make you have a Christian child." Now, I grew up Christian, and I know for a fact Father Hadler never taught us one thing about using our faith to punish women, right? So I reject the notion that Christianity can have anything to do with that. And equally, I reject the notion that Islam has anything to do with what these people are doing. It's a problem within them. They twist the faith to their own ends. And how do we get around it? We start by acknowledging that there is extremism within every philosophy that exists. Everyone. And what is it that leads people to go from the moderate, willing to have a good civic debate, away to the extreme where the only solution is violence? They all twist their philosophy somehow. That's what we have to identify. So I'm not so much sold that the Arizona thing was an act of terrorism. I'm very sold that Joe Stack, who flew an airplane into a building where the IRS was at after writing anti-IRS literature, that was an act of terrorism. What is it in the American psyche right now that has the police standing in front of that building shortly afterwards saying this wasn't an act of terrorism, he's not connected to anything, and then turning to the Muslims and going, by the way, you guys have this lone wolf problem where people are radicalizing on their own?
Just to riff on the 2 points that you raised, yeah, we are actually grossly underrepresentative of a whole bunch of things, to be frank. And you know, we were talking a couple days ago, and since then invited Corey to the panel because not only were we all male, but we were all of a particular nationality. And no, not at all. You're the guy with the tie to legitimate the rest of us. But you know, and if you look at the Muslim community, one of the things about it that is, and actually makes it challenging from a law enforcement profiling standpoint, is that we're multi-ethnic, right? I mean, there are African-American Muslims, there are white Muslims, there are brown Muslims, there's just about every shade. And so, you know, if you apply traditional racial profiling protections, they don't catch us because we're not a racial community. So all that is just to say that we are radically underrepresented, and so please bear with us. On the issue of how to get over the irrational and rational fear, I think there are at least 2 sets of responses. One is endemic to us, defined as Muslim Americans, and one is defined, not limited to, but certainly something that allies can do. So I think for us, and this goes back to Wajahat's point from earlier, we basically have to diversify the associations that America as a whole has with Islam. And we do that by being not just the Muslim person down the street, but like, oh, you know, the dude who saved my cat. oh, you know, that lady who leads the Girl Scout troop, oh, you know, like whatever else, however else we present, if we engage civically outside our community, we will become incrementally more visible. That's very microcosmic, which is to say it doesn't shift the problem. It's just a way to throw, you know, rotten vegetables at a brick wall and hope maybe you'll wear it down. The other thing that we can do, all of us, and that is gets back to what Fouad was saying, call out double standards, expose bigotry, and apply the same intolerance, I would say, of Islamophobia that our broader culture does quite effectively with, say, anti-Semitism, right? I mean, it is simply unacceptable in polite society or on airwaves to say things about some communities. You won't hear people deride Catholics in the way that Muslims are derided every day. It's not acceptable. And that's something that is defined by the political culture. And so we can't do that. Right? Muslim Americans are not in a position to effectuate that norm change. But that's something that broader society can do, and it's something that I think is very much on the table for allies. And, you know, as one of 7 million Muslim Americans in the US, I would just say that, you know, solidarity in that way is very welcome.
Well, I guess I should just very quickly defend myself. Rational fear of Islam, I think, does exist because of a rational threat that exists. There are, in fact, people who proclaim the Islamic faith as they do violent acts, which is separate and distinct from a crazy guy shooting a congresswoman in the head without any clear ideology. I think the concern that I have, and I think we all have, is that there are a segment of, a small, tiny segment of Muslims who commit violent acts or try to commit violent acts, doing so in the name of trying to promote their faith. That is, when they get arrested or as they're committing the act, are proclaiming their faith in God and saying Allahu Akbar or something along those lines. That's the rational threat. I think that I, as a Muslim, am trying to confront that. We as a Muslim community should try to acknowledge and confront that. And that we should understand that non-Muslims in this society are also trying to confront that. And if we have that rational basis of understanding that that exists, that we are trying to confront it, then we can rationally target that fear, rather than to pretend that Glenn Beck is right, that there are 10% of us on this panel or elsewhere that are Islamic terrorists. That's what I'm trying to separate. There's a rational fear and an irrational fear. Anyways, I'm not going to continue. Let's go back to the audience.
Just so you're not alone in a limb, I would actually also agree with Faiz that there does exist. And if you don't acknowledge this, I think you have your head in the sand, especially if you're in the Muslim American community. There are certain radicalized elements within the communities that exist and that we have to confront, and we are confronting. And in fact, if you see in Virginia what happened, the Virginia 5 that went to Pakistan allegedly to engage in jihad, it was their family, their community, and their parents, and I believe even CARE, that went and talked to the FBI. And this is really important to note that that type of threat is not a threat, is a threat to all communities. You know, it's not like, oh, they're Muslims, so we'll protect them. I mean, if Faisal Shahzad in New York was successful, he would have killed Muslims as well. And so effective partnership between law enforcement and multicultural communities in tackling all sorts of extremism, all sorts of terrorism, all sorts of radicalized elements, including the Hutaris, the radicalized Christian militia, who were caught by a convert to Islam, by the way. A lot of people don't know that. A convert to Islam is the one who outed them. I think if we have partnerships, we've seen that that's the way we are successful in battling extremism in America. Just want to throw that out there.
Hi. One suggestion and then a follow-up question. I actually live in research in France. And in thinking about the absence of women on this panel, I think it's sort of not just a question of fairness, but actually a missed opportunity to combat unfortunate stereotypes. In France, in the debate about excluding girls who wear hijab from schools, there's been some really interesting research about the media representation. And when Muslims were brought on the French media to address this issue, it was either Muslim women saying, this is good, they should be excluded from schools, or Muslim men who were brought to defend, oh, these girls should be allowed to be included. And you never saw Muslim women who wore a veil saying, right, no, women should be allowed, and should be allowed to continue their education. And obviously that plays into stereotypes about oh, it's Muslim men who are oppressive, and that is one of the reasons that it's so important that we can continue this persecution. I just wonder whether you all might have missed an opportunity to multiply the images of Muslim women who obviously have much more diverse experiences than are usually seen in the media. So that